Hello class, my name is Rachel and I will be talking to you guys today about isolated children. Topics covered. Today I will give you guys a definition of isolated children. I'll talk about the historical background, the defining characteristics of isolated children. I'll also go over some real cases of Jeannie and Isabel. I'll also talk about Harry Harlow's monkey experiment. And lastly, I'll go over nature versus nurture. Feral children can be subdivided into three classes: isolated children, confined children, and children raised by animals. But today I'm only going to talk about isolated children. Isolated children are children who have lived with limited or no human contact due to abandonment or confinement by their parents and have suffered developmental problems as a result. Social isolation. Isolated children illustrate the importance of socialization. Fact number 1. Neglect is the most common form of child maltreatment, with 59% of the reports of maltreatment classified as neglect in 2007. Fact number 2. Neglect is characterized by parents or caregivers denying children the essential care that they need. Neglect can mean not providing clothing, nutrition, shelter, or medical care. Fact 3. Since 2000, 9 cases of isolated children have been found throughout the world, with the majority of them through abusive parents who have locked their children up in severe physical surroundings while denying them any form of social contact or proper care. Historical background. Fact number 4. According to Friedman and Brown, 1968, isolated humans were first defined by Swedish naturalist Carlos Linnaeus during the Enlightenment period, 1758. Linnaeus used the term to differentiate between man living in society and man reared away from other men. Defining characteristics. Most isolated children have these characteristics. They tend to crawl on all fours. They might spit due to inability to chew. Some of them might be mute. A lot of them have poor hygiene. Their learning might be impaired. They might have lack of language, no socialization skills, and many of them are malnourished. Jeannie is a really good example of an isolated child. She was born in 1957. Her father thought she was mentally retarded, so he locked her up in one of the family bedrooms at the age of 3. The windows were covered with aluminum foil to keep the sunlight and nosy neighbors out. The only furnishings consisted of a cage with a chicken wire lid and a child's potty chair that her father strapped her to. She was hit by a 1x3-foot board each time she made a noise. Her parents kept her locked up for 10 years until she was discovered in 1970, and she was 13 years old. So some results of isolation and neglect. Developmental consequences of extreme social isolation. She crawled along the floor like an animal. Fact number 5. The most important agent of socialization is family. She had the language and motor skills around the most during the most multiple years of our life. Development of if family or caregiver isolates their child, the child will not develop properly. Fact number 6. the critical period hypothesis. The critical period hypothesis was proposed by Lindenberg in 1967. He states that the primary language acquisition must occur during a critical period, ages 2 to puberty. Any language learning will be less successful after this critical period. Susan Curtis, a linguistic professor, tested the critical period hypothesis on Jeannie. Jeannie learned hundreds of words and had a great vocabulary, but she was cognitively deficient in grammar, which means she couldn't form sentences. Susan Curtis then proved the hypothesis to be correct. Susan is also the one that gave Jeannie her name. She quotes, "I chose the name Jeannie because a genie is a creature who emerges out of a bottle and into society." Effects of child isolation. Fact number 7. Child isolation can negatively affect the brain's development. This includes changes to the structure and chemical activity of the brain and an emotional and behavioral functioning of the child. Because Jeannie wasn't spoken to very often, that section of the brain didn't get stimulated, so the brain physically changed. The brain became smaller, less functional, and disconnected. Starved of stimulation, the brain did not have the capacity for language. And as you can see in my picture, you have a normal sized brain, and then you see a brain that went through extreme neglect. And as you can see, it is quite a bit smaller. Fact number 8. 85% of the brain is developed in the first 5 years of life. Early relationships help wire the brain and provide children with experience to trust, to development language, and to communicate, all needed to relate to the world. Isabel is another example of childhood isolation. Isabel's grandfather, kept her and her mother, a deaf mute, in a dark room for 6.5 years because he did not approve of the illegitimate child. As a result of lack of sunlight, fresh air, and proper nutrition, Isabel developed a rachitic condition that made locomotion virtually impossible. She behaved like a deaf child, and her mental capacity was no more than that of a 6-month-old baby. After she was found in 1938, an intense training program was started, and she gradually began to speak. After 2 months she started talking in full sentences, and her IQ tripled in a year and a half. Conclusion. Isabel was found before the critical period ended, so before puberty, so she was able to learn language at full capacity. Isabel proved the critical hypothesis to be correct. Monkeys raised in isolation. Fact number 9. Harry Harlow, an American psychologist, conducted a series of experiments on the effects of isolation on monkeys. Harlow's work has shown that even monkeys' social behavior is learned, not inherited. He observed that monkeys raised in isolation in his labs behaved in a way that is similar to children raised in isolation. The isolated monkeys were fearful of, or hostile to the non-isolated monkeys. They made no attempt to socialize with them. The same is seen in isolated children. Nature versus nurture. Fact number 10. Well, scientists have debated this for years, whether nature or nurture plays a bigger role in personality development. Most social scientists today believe that environmental factors have a bigger influence. So, what do you guys think? Do you agree with the social scientists, what they have to say? Or do you guys think that most of it has to do with nature? All right, and now it is time for the summary. Isolated children are children who have lived with limited or no human contact due to abandonment or confinement by their parents and have suffered developmental problems as a result. Isolated humans were first defined by Carlos Linnaeus during the Enlightenment period, defining characteristics of isolated children. They tend to crawl on all fours, spit due to the inability to chew, they might be mute, have poor hygiene, their learning is impaired, they have lack of language, no socialization skills, and they're malnourished. The most important agent of socialization is family because it is who we are around the most during the most moldable years of our life. Some isolated children acquire normal language ability, but only if found before the onset of puberty or the critical period, and Isabel is an example of that. Other isolated children never master the rules of grammar and syntax because they have reached the critical period, and Jeannie is an example of that. Unless children are exposed to language in the critical period, they lose much of their innate ability to learn a language, and especially its grammatical principles. The critical period hypothesis is not proven, but is strongly supported. And then I also talked about Harlow's work and how he has shown that even in monkeys, social behavior is learned, not inherited.